I'm Rose Evelyn Walker, 32, standing in my grandmother's mansion surrounded by relatives dripping in designer clothes and judgment. My simple blazer earns sneers, like I don't belong, like they forgot we share the same blood. For years, they mocked my empty bank account, my unconventional choices, never realizing I was quietly building something they'd never understand. What they don't know is that the briefcase in my hand doesn't just carry documents, it carries a reckoning. Before I reveal what's inside, drop your location in the comments and hit subscribe, because this is the day I show my family what real wealth looks like. The Walker had ruled Boston real estate since the 1920s, but it was my grandmother Elizabeth who gave the name real, meaning quiet, strategic wealth built with purpose. My father inherited that mindset and shocked the family by marrying my mother, a kindergarten teacher. They chose a simple life until a tragic car crash left me orphaned at 15. I moved in with Grandma, while whispers labeled me the family's charity case. But behind closed doors, she taught me everything: real estate, markets, legacy. While my cousins chased flashy lifestyles, I drove my parents' old Toyota and invested every spare dollar. When Grandma passed, we each got a modest inheritance. They burned theirs on yachts and fashion. I bought undervalued properties quietly, smartly. By 28, I owned 12 residential units and 3 commercial buildings under LLCs. They flaunted wealth. I built it, just like Grandma taught me. Last year, I made a move none of them saw coming. The apartment complex where Uncle Richard's daughter Victoria and cousin Blake lived quietly hit the market, its aging owner looking for a discreet exit. With Mr. Winter's help, I bought the entire building for $28 million, pouring in nearly every dollar I had. I kept the upgrades subtle, the rent reasonable, and my name off everything. They never knew I became their landlord. Now, with the family conference looming, word spread that Uncle Richard planned to sell Grandma's mansion, the last piece of her legacy. As they prepared to erase her memory for profit, they still looked down on me, the so-called poor cousin, not realizing I held the deeds to their very homes. When I pulled up in my weathered Toyota, it stood out like a bruise among the Bentleys and Maseratis. But I wasn't here to impress. I was here to reclaim. I adjusted my thrifted blazer, looked up at that familiar brick mansion, and walked up those steps, not as the outsider, but as the woman holding the real power in the room. Martha, our longtime housekeeper, greeted me with the only real warmth I'd feel all day. Her eyes sparkled. "You're more like your grandmother every year," she whispered. Then came the quiet warning. Richard had been there all morning, calling lawyers, shifting the schedule. He thought he was about to make the biggest move of the day. He had no idea I was already 5 steps ahead. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Returning to my old room, the one I lived in during the years Grandma raised me, felt less like a warm homecoming and more like stepping into a museum exhibit titled, "The Last Time Anyone Gave a Damn." The pale blue walls, pristine white furniture, and the window seat overlooking her rose garden were all perfectly frozen in time. Unlike the rest of the house, now dripping in gaudy renovations and bad taste, this room still held meaning. My old finance textbook sat proudly on the shelf along with Grandma's handwritten stock notes and a faded photo of my parents and me back when love and legacy actually meant something in this family. As I unpacked, a knock shattered the moment. Emily Brooks stood there, my only relative who didn't treat me like a charity case in a clearance rack blazer. She was still clad in designer everything, but at least she came bearing honesty. And a warning. Uncle Richard was planning to sell the mansion. Of course he was, because why honor Grandma's memory when you can bulldoze it for profit? She explained how Richard had already secured most of the family votes thanks to the brilliant little governance structure he rigged after Grandma died, where voting power magically aligned with declared financial contributions, meaning he who flaunts the most cash gets the loudest voice. And me? I was practically mute in their eyes, despite quietly owning more than half of them could ever dream of. But what twisted the knife wasn't the sale, it was what it represented. This house wasn't just real estate. It was Grandma's legacy, her values, her voice. And watching them plot to turn it into another soulless row of luxury condos felt like they weren't just selling a building, they were auctioning off her soul. And if they thought I'd sit quietly through that, they clearly forgot who raised me. The idea of Grandma's mansion being torn down to make way for luxury condos didn't just sting, it felt like a knife to the heart. This wasn't about property, it was about erasing the woman who had poured her soul into this family. "I'm going to fight this," I told Emily Brooks, and she didn't hesitate. She said she'd stand with me, but she also warned me. The pushback would be brutal. And she was right. The digs started early. Victoria had the nerve to ask if the poor cousin had finally arrived. I smiled politely, but inside, I was already bracing for battle. Dinner was a parade of inflated egos and performative wealth. Richard held court at the head of the table in Grandma's chair, no less bragging about his next overpriced development like he was building cathedrals, not condos. Catherine slipped in a jab about how my name hadn't appeared on any of her gala donor lists, while Brad wouldn't shut up about his Maserati. "Still driving that old Toyota?" he smirked. "Still runs like a dream," I replied with a smile, knowing full well I could buy 3 of his cars in cash. Patricia chimed in with her usual passive-aggressive charm, suggesting ILE. Standing in Grandma's rose garden, I promised myself I wouldn't let her legacy be turned into just another profit line. I wasn't only fighting for a house, I was fighting for the woman who believed in me when no one else did. If it meant revealing the empire I'd built in silence, then so be it. Saturday morning, sunlight streamed through my old bedroom window like it used to when Grandma would wake me for tea. I dressed carefully professional but understated and headed to the drawing room where the family conference would take place. The portraits were gone, replaced with cold renderings of sleek condos. It felt like a warning shot. Uncle Richard stood front and center, clicker in hand, ready to sell a dream that wasn't his to offer. "Image is currency," he said, his expensive shoes clicking across the floor. "The Walker name opens doors if we uphold certain standards." He looked straight at me when he said it. I didn't blink. Then came the final blow, a full-screen photo of Grandma's mansion. "Sentimental, yes," Richard said, "but the land is worth $45 million. Around me, heads nodded. But in that moment, I realized they weren't just selling a house. They were burying her memory. And I was done staying quiet. Aunt Victoria, poised in her designer suit and flawless hair, raised her manicured hand. "Rose Evelyn, before we proceed, let's acknowledge that some of us may have emotional ties to the old house." She turned to me with a smile so polished, it almost hid the condescension. "Of course we respect your history here, but sentiment can't outweigh smart financial decisions." Before I could respond, Blake cut in, smug as ever. "Speaking of smart, did anyone see my new SL Roadster outside? Limited edition, only 20 in North America." Laughter rippled through the room, and the message was clear. Status, not legacy, ruled here. Richard nodded approvingly. "Exactly the kind of image that sustains our family's reputation," he said, then launched into his pitch to sell the mansion, divide the profits by financial holdings, and replace it with high-end condos. Brochures were passed out. each one colder than the last. I raised my hand. Richard gave me a look, like I was interrupting something far more important. "I believe we should honor Grandma Elizabeth's wishes," I said, steadying my voice. "She wanted this home preserved for gatherings, for memory. Some things have value beyond price." Richard dismissed me with a tight smile. "Times change. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Catherine chimed in with a laugh. "Maybe best to leave real estate." Brad's laughter cut through the room, sharp and smug. "What do you know about real estate? Still renting that tiny apartment downtown, right?" His jab stung, and the chuckles that followed only twisted the knife. "My housing choices are deliberate," I replied, steady but tight. Brad didn't let up. "Some of us can afford choices. Others just pretend their limitations are intentional." Richard, ever neutral when it suited him, moved us straight into the vote. As expected, only Emily Brooks and I opposed the sale. It wasn't just a blow to Grandma's house. It was a brutal reminder that in this family, respect was sold to the highest bidder. As lunch was called, I felt the familiar ache of being overlooked, still seen as the poor relation, irrelevant and unheard. I escaped to the garden, to the stone bench, where Grandma once whispered our family's history. Emily Brooks joined me quietly. "They can be awful," she said. I nodded, trying to hold back the frustration. "They've never asked about my life. They just assume I've failed because I don't flaunt things." She squeezed my hand. "You've carved your own path. That's more impressive than any luxury car." Her words comforted me, but the hurt lingered. I had told myself for years that their approval didn't matter, yet their condescension still left a mark. As we headed back inside, Emily Brooks lowered her voice. "Tomorrow gets worse. Everyone has to present their financial highlights. Richard made sure it's all about who's keeping the Walker name elite." I straightened my shoulders. Let them talk. Tomorrow they'd find out just how wrong they'd been. Dinner felt more like a luxury developer's brainstorm than a family meal. They argued over rooftop gardens versus infinity pools, marble versus imported limestone, as if replacing Grandma's house with condos was a creative passion project, not a slow-motion betrayal. I sat silently, wondering when legacy became just another design choice. Sunday, the masks came off. The drawing room turned boardroom, complete with leather portfolios, mine, of course, the thinnest. Richard, in full corporate king mode, read out the voting shares. 38% for himself, 2% for me. I guess legacy only counts if you can buy it in bulk. Then came his real play, streamlining Grandma's will. In plain English, hand him the reins. The room nodded like good little shareholders. I said nothing, but I was already memorizing every detail. They still think I'm harmless. They're wrong. Then came the brag parade, vacation estates, new yachts, private school perks, even staffing woes for third homes made the cut. I smiled tightly. Let them gloat. They don't know it yet, but I'm the biggest threat in the room. "They only work with certain families, but I'll put in a word," Aunt Catherine offered, as if handing out golden tickets. Conversation shifted to the luxury apartment building where several family members lived, the very one I secretly owned. "The amenities are great," Victoria sniffed, "but management's been disruptive renovating the lobby, all that noise." Blake chimed in, "And they raised the rent last quarter. Not a lot, but still, on principle." Brad leaned forward, frowning. "No one knows who owns it anymore, bought by some mystery holding company last year." Uncle Richard tapped his pen like he was plotting a takeover. "We should look into it. If it's an investment group, we might persuade them to sell. The location's valuable. We benefit from controlling it." I kept my face still while my heart pounded. Richard continued, casually suggesting using city connections to make renovation approvals difficult. The ease with which they discussed pressuring an anonymous owner made my stomach turn. This was exactly the kind of entitlement Grandma had warned me about. Power not used to build, but to take. When my turn finally came, I presented a quiet summary of my consulting work and steady investment growth. No one cared. Brad scrolled his phone, Victoria whispered, and Richard drummed his fingers. The moment I paused, Aunt Catherine pounced. "Dear, have you considered a more substantial career? With the Walker name, surely—" I didn't get to answer. Brad smirked. "Maybe she just needs to marry well. That's still a valid strategy, right?" Laughter followed. I kept my face calm. I'm quite satisfied with my current path. Not everyone defines success the same way. Then came the final insult. "Perhaps," Richard said smoothly, "we should establish a provision for family members needing additional support." He didn't look at me, but everyone did. Charity wrapped in condescension. I sat stiffly, hands clenched beneath the table, while they debated my future as if I weren't in the room. That night, I called Mr. Winters. "They're trying to change Grandma's will," I said, voice low, "and they're digging into the apartment building." He chuckled gently. "Your ownership is protected. They won't find you. But the real question is, what do you want to do now?" I looked out at Grandma's garden under the moonlight, my chest heavy. It's not just about protecting my assets anymore. They're trying to destroy everything she stood for. And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't just protect her legacy. I'd fight for it. Returning to my old room, the one I lived in during the years Grandma raised me, felt less like a warm homecoming and more like stepping into a museum exhibit titled, "The Last Time Anyone Gave a Damn." The pale blue walls, pristine white furniture, and the window seat overlooking her rose garden were all perfectly frozen in time. Unlike the rest of the house, now dripping in gaudy renovations and bad taste, this room still held meaning. My old finance textbook sat proudly on the shelf along with Grandma's handwritten stock notes and a faded photo of my parents and me back when love and legacy actually meant something in this family. As I unpacked, a knock shattered the moment. Emily Brooks stood there, my only relative who didn't treat me like a charity case in a clearance rack blazer. She was still clad in designer everything, but at least she came bearing honesty. And a warning. Uncle Richard was planning to sell the mansion. Of course he was, because why honor Grandma's memory when you can bulldoze it for profit? She explained how Richard had already secured most of the family votes thanks to the brilliant little governance structure he rigged after Grandma died, where voting power magically aligned with declared financial contributions, meaning he who flaunts the most cash gets the loudest voice. And me? I was practically mute in their eyes, despite quietly owning more than half of them could ever dream of. But what twisted the knife wasn't the sale, it was what it represented. This house wasn't just real estate. It was Grandma's legacy, her values, her voice. And watching them plot to turn it into another soulless row of luxury condos felt like they weren't just selling a building, they were auctioning off her soul. And if they thought I'd sit quietly through that, they clearly forgot who raised me. The idea of Grandma's mansion being torn down to make way for luxury condos didn't just sting. It felt like a knife to the heart. This wasn't about property. It was about erasing the woman who had poured her soul into this family. "I'm going to fight this," I told Emily Brooks, and she didn't hesitate. She said she'd stand with me, but she also warned me. The pushback would be brutal. And she was right. The digs started early. Victoria had the nerve to ask if the poor cousin had finally arrived. I smiled politely, but inside, I was already bracing for battle. Dinner was a parade of inflated egos and performative wealth. Richard held court at the head of the table in Grandma's chair, no less bragging about his next overpriced development like he was building cathedrals, not condos. Catherine slipped in a jab about how my name hadn't appeared on any of her gala donor lists, while Brad wouldn't shut up about his Maserati. "Still driving that old Toyota?" he smirked. "Still runs like a dream," I replied with a smile, knowing full well I could buy 3 of his cars in cash. Patricia chimed in with her usual passive-aggressive charm, suggesting ILE. I sat by the window where Grandma and I once watched the garden together, her favorite place. "What would you do now?" I whispered, aching for her clarity. In that quiet moment, the sting of humiliation gave way to resolve. This mansion, this legacy, it belonged to me too, and I had honored it in ways they couldn't begin to grasp. Martha entered with a cup of tea and concern in her eyes. "They still see me as the orphan they pitied," I said. She sat beside me and smiled gently. "Your grandmother always said true wealth is invisible, and that you were the only one who truly understood what the Walker legacy meant." Her words soothed something raw in me. Once she left, I opened the package from Mr. Winters. Inside was everything: deeds, portfolio valuations, and the proof that I owned the apartment complex where several of them now lived. For a moment, I questioned whether they even deserved to know. But I knew this wasn't about their approval. It was about honoring Grandma's vision. That afternoon, Uncle Richard brought up complaints about tenant issues in the very building I owned. I listened in silence, documents tucked in my portfolio, watching them rant about renovations I had approved. The irony was delicious. They still thought I was small. Tomorrow, they'd finally learn the truth. Victoria husked her perfectly styled hair in irritation. "The contractors start at 9 a.m. 9! Who wants to hear construction during breakfast?" Blake chimed in, complaining about the new guest registration policy. "I had to register my housekeeper as a visitor. Do they not know who we are?" Richard leaned forward, declaring that this is why families should control key properties, because new owners, apparently, don't understand the needs of prestigious tenants. I stayed silent, knowing those policies, security upgrades after a break-in, and guest rules after resident complaints, had been my decisions. Improvements that raised the building's value by 12%, yet all they noticed were minor inconveniences. Then Richard casually mentioned having his lawyer investigate the ownership. This was in my ownership through shell companies. "They might be vulnerable to pressure," he said, outlining a plan to intimidate the mystery buyer. My calm held, barely. "What kind of pressure?" I asked evenly. Richard smirked. "Influence over approvals, city inspections, tax reviews. With 5 family members as tenants, we can make things uncomfortable." Brad laughed, proud of the tactic. Their arrogance, their entitlement, made something crack inside me. This was exactly the kind of manipulation Grandma had warned me about. Then Brad turned to me. "This is how real estate works, Rose Evelyn. Not that you'd know, still renting that little apartment, right?" The room went still, followed by nervous laughter. It wasn't just their mockery, it was the Then Brad turned to me. "This is how real estate works, Rose Evelyn. Not that you'd know, still renting that little apartment, right?" The room went still, followed by nervous laughter. It wasn't just their mockery, it was the corruption masked as legacy. Richard, unfazed, moved on to finalize the vote to sell Grandma's mansion, proving once again that to them, power meant leverage, not integrity. Richard gestured confidently around the room. "The developers made an excellent offer. Luxury condos here would benefit us all." I raised my hand, refusing to let Grandma's home be reduced to profit. "What if we turned it into a Bennett family foundation? Preserve the house, honor her legacy." Richard dismissed it immediately. "Sentiment doesn't pay," he said. Catherine added, "Some of us have real responsibilities, Rose Evelyn." The vote was no surprise. Richard and his allies controlled everything. Emily Brooks and I were the only ones who voted no. Back in my room, I called Mr. Winters. "They're selling the mansion," I told him, staring at the garden Grandma once loved. "And they plan to pressure the mystery owner of Victoria's building me into selling too." He chuckled. "They have no idea." I asked him to transfer all my holdings into a new entity to buy the mansion first. Call it Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. It was time to act. That night, I laid everything out: deeds, financials, ownership papers. Years of quiet work, all organized and ready. My net worth was more than any of them imagined. I wasn't doing this for applause or revenge. I was doing it for Grandma, for everything the Bennett name was meant to stand for. By the time I closed my folder, the pain had hardened into purpose. I didn't care if they respected me. I knew who I was, and tomorrow, they would too. I now owned 15 properties, 12 residential in prime areas, 3 commercial in fast-growing zones, and the luxury apartment complex where several family members unknowingly lived. My total assets had surpassed $73 million, more than Brad, Blake, and Victoria combined. I arranged all the documents into a sleek leather portfolio, matching the kind my cousins flaunted at family meetings. For once, I chose presentation over practicality, not for vanity, but to make a statement they couldn't ignore. As I organized everything, memories of Grandma filled the room. I could still hear her voice. Showing off your money means you're spending, not growing. She taught me that real wealth meant building security, not chasing status. While my cousins were busy buying flashy condos in overdeveloped neighborhoods, I invested in overlooked areas, on the verge of renewal, just like she taught me. My first property had been a modest duplex. I lived in one unit, rented the other, and used the income to pay the mortgage. 2 years later, I sold it for nearly double and used the profits to buy more. I kept living simply, reinvesting every dollar. The apartment complex was my biggest risk, but my analysis was solid, and the payoff exceeded expectations. I pulled out Grandma's handwritten investment journal, a gift on my 18th birthday. Its pages were worn, filled with lessons that had guided every decision. This wasn't just strategy, it was legacy. And tomorrow, it would speak louder than any luxury car or designer label ever could. The first entry in Grandma's journal, written in my teenage scrawl, recorded a $500 investment into a mutual fund she recommended. Page by page, it traced my journey from cautious stock picks to more strategic, long-term investments, all grounded in her values: patience, research, and substance over flash. Her handwritten notes still guided me. Excellent analysis, Rose Evelyn. Consider the 10-year potential, not the 2-year return. Even in her absence, she was still teaching me. That night, a message from Mr. Winters confirmed everything was ready. Elizabeth's legacy trust had been officially established, and all documents were prepared. As I organized the final materials for tomorrow's reveal, I reminded myself this wasn't about showing off my success. It was about honoring the legacy of the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Just before midnight, a soft knock startled me. Emily Brooks stood in the hallway, concern on her face. She stepped inside and spotted the documents spread across my bed. Her eyes widened. "Rose Evelyn, what is all this?" She picked up a folder and froze. It was the deed to the apartment complex she lived in. You're the owner they've been complaining about?" I nodded. For the first time, someone in the family finally saw the truth, and I felt a quiet relief. Emily Brooks laughed in disbelief. "Brad said someone should teach you real estate. He's going to lose it." Then her voice softened. "Are you sure? Once they know, it all changes." I nodded. I don't want their approval. I want to protect what Grandma built, the real legacy, not Richard's version. I told her my plan to buy the mansion through the trust. She listened, then whispered, "She would be proud of you." And for the first time in years, I believed it too. Emily Brooks squeezed my hand. She'd be proud of you. I'll be right beside you tomorrow." After she left, I laid out my outfit. A tailored charcoal suit, simple and strong, with Grandma's pearl necklace as the only accessory. No flashy labels, just quiet confidence. It felt like armor, not decoration. That night, a calm settled over me. The girl they once pitied was gone. I had built something real, on my own terms. As I looked out at the moonlit garden, I whispered, "Watch me tomorrow, Grandma. I think you'll be proud." Tuesday morning arrived sharp and clear. I dressed with care, added a touch of red lipstick, not to impress, but as war paint. At 8:50, I placed my leather portfolio at my seat in the conference room, then stepped out to steady myself. At 9 sharp, I returned. Richard didn't even acknowledge me. He jumped into the agenda. Finalize the mansion sale, discuss the apartment complex. Folders were passed. They all murmured over their expected payouts. Richard would get nearly $18 million. My 2%? Less than 1. But I was ready, because the truth in my portfolio carried far more power. We've drafted a letter from the family attorney suggesting a code compliance review might be forthcoming unless the owner is open to a reasonable offer, Richard said casually, as if legal harassment was just another negotiation tactic. My blood boiled, but I kept my expression composed. "Before we move forward with any of this," I said, standing, voice clear and calm, "I'd like the floor for a brief presentation." Richard glanced at his watch. "We're on a tight schedule, Eliza. Developers expect contracts by noon." "This won't take long," I replied, already moving to the front. My assertiveness silenced the room. I opened my portfolio and held up a single document, my latest valuation. For years, I've endured the whispers, the pity, the mockery. Today, we correct the record. I handed the report to Richard's assistant. She loaded it onto the projector. $73 million net worth. Silence. Shock. Brad sputtered, "There must be some mistake." I smiled. "No mistake. While you've been flaunting wealth, I've been building it." I distributed my statements. Aunt Catherine blinked. "But you live in a small apartment." "By choice," I replied. "Grandma taught me the difference between displaying wealth and creating it." Richard's face had turned gray. "How did you manage this without our network?" "Grandma's principles. Patient investing. Identifying undervalued properties. The very values this family abandoned." I placed another document in front of Victoria. "As for the mysterious apartment owner you plan to pressure, you're all my tenants." Chaos erupted. Blake spilled water. Brad stammered. Victoria froze. Richard barked, "That building cost over $20 million. 28, I corrected. Acquired legally, ethically, through a decade of growth. I turned to Blake and Victoria. "That construction you hated? Security upgrades I ordered after a break-in. The guest policy? Because of 3 prior security breaches." Their stunned expressions said it all. Uncle Richard went pale as I laid down the final document. "As of this morning," I said, "I've transferred my holdings into Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, which now owns Jenkins Development, holder of 30% of Walker Family Holdings." His shock was visible. "That's not possible." I looked around. "You were all so convinced I had nothing. You never noticed what I was building." "I now control 35% of the voting shares," I continued, "enough to block the mansion sale." The room froze. Emily Brooks clapped. "Well played." Brad scoffed. "You've done nothing for the family." I answered, "I preserved what mattered, my grandma's legacy." "The sale is off," I said. "And no, I won't evict anyone from the apartment complex, but I will review the discounts." Richard, shifting tone, offered, "Let's collaborate." I nodded. "Only if we return to Grandma's values, real stewardship, not a show." In the days after, everything changed. Richard invited me to lunch. Catherine reached out too. Suddenly, they saw me. But I didn't need their praise. I had kept the true Walker legacy alive, and now I would lead on my own terms. Aunt Catherine's strained smile barely hid years of condescension. "Family is so important, don't you think?" she said, patting my hand like we hadn't spent decades apart. Brad took longer, wounded pride delaying his call. When it came, it was a business pitch disguised as a compliment. I declined, reminding him of Grandma's values. Emily Brooks remained my truest ally. "Watching the Walker adapt is like a nature documentary," she joked. Her support helped me draw clear lines, offering second chances to those who showed remorse and keeping others at a professional distance. The first big step? Turning Grandma's mansion into the Elizabeth Walker Foundation, focused on affordable housing and financial education. The same relatives who once belittled me now attended events at a property I saved, unaware it was funded by the very wealth they dismissed. I kept my apartment and Toyota by choice. The freedom of living by my values was more precious than flaunting my status. They no longer questioned my simplicity, just struggled to understand it. 6 months later, at a foundation gala, Martha approached me. Her voice soft, her hand warm on mine. "Your grandmother visits me in dreams sometimes." And in that moment, I knew I had done exactly what Grandma would have hoped, for restored not just the house, but the heart of her legacy. At the foundation event, Martha gently took my hand. "Your grandmother visits me in dreams," she said. Last night, she was glowing. She said you understood what the others forgot, that wealth should protect and uplift, not show off. Her words meant more than any belated respect from family. Though healing wasn't instant, old wounds still surfaced. I had stepped into the role Grandma always believed I could fill, the true steward of her legacy. The biggest lesson wasn't about money, it was about authenticity. For years, I let them misunderstand me, partly for strategy, partly because I still craved approval. But real freedom came the day I stopped needing it. I learned that success without integrity is hollow, wealth without purpose is a burden, and family without respect isn't worth chasing. Today, I sit in Grandma's rose garden, now a part of the foundation that helps young people like my mother once was. I still drive my reliable Toyota, while Uncle Richard arrives in a Bentley. The difference? We both know it's by choice. Uncle Richard hadn't just accepted defeat. He'd gone quiet. Too quiet. And then, one night, I intercepted an email not meant for me, coded but unmistakably dangerous. A solution to the Bennett Trust problem. Me. Now I realize this wasn't just about money. It was about, stay tuned. You haven't heard the darkest part yet.